and they're stable, then, they make very good leaders. And equally, they can be very easygoing and laid back, as we said. That's a wonderful quality, to be able to keep your head when all around are losing theirs. It's that proper use of that laid backness and objectivity, but you still have to stay engaged. It can't be a switched off easygoingness. They can be very efficient, and I'm using that as almost an equivalent to the melancholic organized. For example, a lot of bankers and accountants and people like that used to be phlegmatic. Some still are, especially accountancy. That's not obviously exclusively so, but they like things in columns, well organized, and they have their own version of organization. So again, that's an engaged and secure phlegmatic. They can be very practical. And again, this is the chalk and cheese thing. Phlegmatic can shy away from DIY, for example, and never engage and then protect themselves from it. Or if they choose to learn, they can be very, very good. They can be humorous. It's often a dry, observational type of humor. But if they're using that tenderness that we talked about to really engage, they can feel what the other person's feeling, so it doesn't have to be unkind humor. They can bring a lot of fun into a situation. As we've said already, they can be very dependable and very calm. And I've also used the word conservative with a small c, because although there is a place for being expansive and generous and so on, you often need somebody who will just be cautious. I've got a good friend in business who says every business needs a phlegmatic accountant. It would be for that reason, that they will think the thing through and not act foolishly, hopefully, when it comes to the way that they use the resources. So that's quite a description of the phlegmatic.
That is a very lovely description. I'm wondering as well, just with the same, as I asked for the melancholic, a few keys to remember or to think about if you find, a lot of these character traits.
Yes, these are things really more to bear in mind when either if you're a phlegmatic yourself, or you're working with, or, love somebody who also has this temperament. So the first things to bear in mind: feels fragile, so they will protect themselves. If you kind of hold that in mind, for example, when you're engaging in conversation, you might think, oh, this person's being awkward. And yeah, they probably are, but they're probably scared. They may not admit that. You're probably not likely to blurt out, what you're scared about. But actually, there will be a way of reaching that person's heart. Now, they won't always let you, but remember, they're protecting themselves because they're fearful of what they're lacking. Whether they lack it or not, they probably don't. It's what they fear about themselves. So remember that, and that leads to taking the line of least resistance, and that will be in all the ways that we talked about, whether it's procrastination, indecisive, and all the rest. And in a way, for the phlegmatic, that power of choice that we touched on, that's a key here. You can make excuses forever for yourself if you're a phlegmatic, or for somebody else, but there comes a point where that little thing is very true. Just do it. Just do it. And when you do it, you feel better. You've broken through your own internal barrier. So, don't stay taking the line of least resistance. Get involved. Don't stand on the edge. Deliberately engage in the conversation. Deliberately become part of working out a solution, and not just the silent person who lets everybody else get on with it. So don't stand on the edge. We touched on the fact that when a phlegmatic gets a strong conviction about something, they can make a great leader. They can also use that attribute to be very stubborn. Well, being stubborn's all right if you're not digging your heels in over doing what's right. If you see what I mean, if you're doing wrong and somebody's trying to get you to do what's right, being stubborn's not a good thing. But if you choose to do what's right, be stubborn about doing right. And that's where that sort of inner strength that is there inherently is put to good use. Be stubborn for doing good and stick with it and make a difference in this big world.
So helpful. I am wondering, I know we've gone a little bit over the usual time of these episodes, but this is just, it's so useful. And to kind of bring this into landing, I'm wondering what happens when someone's listening to this and they say, you know, I'm both of these. I know for me, when I hear about the phlegmatic, the majority of what you said, I just can't relate that much to, you know. So I know that I'm very much of the melancholic introvert.
Yes.
What if somebody can relate to both and all qualities?
Yes. It's just very possible, even likely, that you are a double introvert. In other words, you have got both introvert temperaments. And when we do look at the extrovert temperaments, you may not recognize either of them because you don't have to have an extrovert temperament. So there's a good possibility. It's also possible, going back to the illustration of the floor puzzle, when you take a kind of cursory glance at the pieces all lying there mixed up on the floor of these 4 different pictures, or that when you put the pieces together, they will form 4 different pictures. A lot of those pictures look similar. So, for example, the sort of negativity of the melancholic could easily be mistaken, say, for the anxiety of the phlegmatic. The tenderness of the phlegmatic could be mistaken for the sensitivity of the melancholic, and so on. It will feel like there's an overlap, but they're 2 very different creatures, if I can put it like that, and it's important to recognize that they are. But yes, you may well be a double introvert, and that's absolutely, in fact, that's a wonderful temperament mix to have.
Is it wonderful? Because then you've got all the problems of the negatives of the melancholic and then the phlegmatic as well. How do you know, you've got, where would a double introvert start? What would their question be? You know, because if they're both very feeling and then as well able to switch off.
Yes. Yes. Well, an interesting thing here, I kind of tend to see these temperaments quite visually in my mind. And so, for example, a double introvert, I would see a square with the melancholic at the bottom, if you like. That's not to make any comment about, you know, value, but sitting on top is the phlegmatic. And so the phlegmatic takes on the role of extrovert, or tries to. So the phlegmatic is, as we said earlier on, a bit of a chameleon and can act like a choleric, say in a work situation, or like a sanguine in a leisure situation. The trouble is, they're aware that they don't make as good a job of it as somebody who is actually a choleric or somebody who is a sanguine. So they do end up feeling they're just not quite good enough, and that can produce a real struggle. I know a number of people that have that temperament mix. I happen to marry one. One of my sons happened to have that mix, and so I've, for example, with my son, I've said, you have a double whammy of absolute quality, and it's getting the person to accept anything that they feel they might be missing out on by not having an extrovert, they more than make up for by having that incredible mix of the two introvert temperaments. And there's a richness and there's a depth. You know, a lot of people with extrovert and introvert spend half their lives trying to make sure that they're living in their introvert or else avoiding it. And there's that battle between extrovert and introvert. Whereas for a double introvert, well, at least they're living in an introvert all the time. The real challenge for the double introvert is to live in both those temperaments, because, as we said, the phlegmatic can act as an extrovert and end up protecting the melancholic with all its sensitivity from the costly relationships that are around them, and especially with that feeling of not being quite good enough. So the phlegmatic can be like a big buffer and can exercise control and prevent the melancholic from giving proper expression to himself or herself, and can prevent somebody from really reaching the melancholic. But if that double introvert's been brought up in a secure environment, you get an amazing double whammy of just sheer goodness.
Wow, John, thank you so much for those wonderful insights into the two introvert temperaments. I hope you enjoyed that episode.